Post-punk is a genre that started at almost the same time as punk, with bands taking the anti-establishment attitude of punk. But instead of stripping rock music back to its simplest roots, they ran on the idea that the rules we were taught about music could be broken and ignored. This led to an outpouring of new creativity. Bands like Wire, Joy Division, Susie and the Banshees, and then as the 80s came along, bands like U2 and REM helped to define what this sound could be. But post-punk evolved into a variety of other subgenres, arguably being the foundation of goth rock, and having an impact on bands who would go on to be important in industrial music as well, like Killing Joke and Cabaret Voltaire. But many of these early post-punk bands have been mostly forgotten, or at least don't get as much attention and credit as I think they ought to. And those are the bands that I want to focus on today, in looking at some of the early post-punk bands who are less well-known. And since I recently covered modern goth bands, I'll be mentioning which of these bands have what I think is a goth appeal. That is, their sound matches the goth vibe enough that I think goths would enjoy them as well. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism. Nowadays, we often think of post-punk in a more narrow sense, thinking of specific bands as the origin points like Joy Division and Susie and the Banshees. Originally, post-punk was anything that was building upon the ideas of punk, the DIY spirit, the taking of music back to its roots, and doing something new with it, expanding beyond just that. There was a lot of experimentation along the borders of rock with funk, with groove-based music, with disco even, or with free jazz. So you'll see some of those other inspirations reflected in this list. My process for this video went kind of like this. I started with a couple of the bands that I've heard people talk about as being underrated and underknown, looked at their listener counts on Spotify, then focused my list on bands that were either at that amount or lower. So we're going all the way from around 160,000 monthly listeners down to less than 1,000. And these are all bands that formed in the late 70s to the early 80s, with I think one exception that might be a little bit later. In terms of the order, I'm going through based on the subscriber count, so we're going to start with the bands that have the most listeners and work our way to the most obscure as we get towards the end of the list. And finally, while working on this list, I came up with a list of over 30 bands. I went through and I picked out the 10 that I basically wanted to talk about the most. If you want to see more early post-punk bands that are underrated and underknown, let me know and I'm happy to come back and revisit this topic down the road. We're starting with the two bands that I often hear people talk about as underrated. To me, they both seem to have pretty healthy listener counts. First, at 160,000, we have The Sound. This band formed in 1979 in London, England, primarily the project of Adrian Borland. They're mostly well known, by those who do know them, for their first two albums, Jeopardy and From the Lion's Mouth. Although critically successful, they never saw much commercial success, despite being on a major label and receiving some promotion from John Peel and the show Old Grey Whistle Test. As the 80s went on, Adrian Borland struggled more and more with mental illness, and this was a factor in the band collapsing by the end of the decade. Adrian was musically active for the remainder of his life until he died by suicide in 1999. He was an excellent songwriter, and some critics have even called The Sound the best of the post-punk bands, even beyond groups like Echo and the Bunnymen and U2. What I'll say is that Adrian Borland's music has a powerful intensity to it, and it is a very vital post-punk sound. It has a heaviness, and there's a certain gothicness to it that I think will appeal to some goth listeners as well. Both Jeopardy and From the Lion's Mouth are post-punk albums I consider classics and things you should definitely check out. Number 2, the Chameleons, a band with 158,000 monthly listeners. So, after exploring this topic for a bit, it became clear that the Chameleons are the post-punk world's favorite forgotten band. If you've been exploring post-punk for a while, you probably know about them already, because even though they weren't well known back when they were making their classic albums in the 80s, they've since started to be recognized for how good they are, and have developed a cult following. But I'm including them on this list for any of you who may have missed them, and also because they're one of my favorite post-punk bands, full stop. The Chameleons formed in Middleton, Greater Manchester, in 1981. They released 3 albums that received mostly critical acclaim, but didn't sell amazingly well, and then disbanded when their manager passed away. Script of the Bridge is the most celebrated of these 3, and this album has the most angsty and sometimes goth sound. I recommend hearing all 3 of these albums. The first one is obviously the most popular, but Strange Times is actually my favorite, so make sure you hear that first one and that third one. If you already know the Chameleons, here's something you may not know. After they disbanded, their songwriter Mark Burgess went on to form The Sun and the Moon with the Chameleons' drummer John Lever, and 2 other musicians. Since you have the same songwriter as the Chameleons, there's a lot of the same characteristics to the songs, although there's a bit less dark of a tone, at least in terms of the music, since Mark's lyrics are still pretty angsty and dark. If you're a Chameleons fan and haven't explored them yet, go check them out. It's also worth knowing that the Chameleons have more recently reformed and are performing in pretty close to top form, honestly. They just released a new EP in October, Tomorrow Remember Yesterday. They've put out another recent EP, both of which I think are a good follow-up to their work from the 80s. It has that same feel, and the quality is really high as well, so please check those out too. Number 3, Xmal Deutschland, with 96,000 listeners. This is another band I thought would be listened to a lot more than they are. First, they were on the 4AD label, who in the 80s was quite well known for having a roster of great underground artists. They were pretty popular in their own time as well. It feels like they're discussed in goth circles a decent amount, thanks to Incubus Succubus being a goth classic. And it's not like 90-something thousand listeners is nothing, but they're clearly getting a lot less attention than the Chameleons, so let's talk about them. Xmal Deutschland formed in 1980 in Hamburg, Germany. They had an early single, Incubus Succubus, which, as I said, is a goth classic. Their debut album, Fetish, is an excellent post-punk goth rock album I'd recommend to those interested in either genre. Their second album, Toxin, is also following in the same sort of goth rock vein. It feels a little more measured, a little bit gentler, but it still has that gothic rock feel to it, and I enjoy the second one almost as much as the first album. So both of these are definitely worth checking out. Their later albums are also good, but I would say that the first 2 are definitely essential listening. One of the big draws for me to the band are the vocals of Anya Hugh. She's often compared to Susie Sue, and I think that there's some ground for that comparison, but I think a lot of it probably comes down to the fact that they were both doing fairly similar styles of music at around the same time, and often female performers get compared to one another. I find Anya's delivery a bit colder and a bit sharper than Susie Sue's. Sometimes she verges on something that feels more like a punk shout than you often get with Susie as well. And before we move on completely from Anya Hugh, she actually just released, at the age of 66, her first solo album. I've not had a chance to listen to this yet, I just discovered it while working on this video, but I'm excited to see what she's doing now. In summary, this is another great goth-sounding post-punk band who released a set of great albums in the 80s and didn't last much longer than the decade. They never had a steep drop in album quality, so starting at the beginning of their career and working your way forward is a great way to approach them. For Band 4, we're staying in Germany, but going to Dusseldorf. At 80,000 listeners, we have Fehlfarben. I have no idea. This band formed in 1979 and made their first album in 1980. This album, which translates to Monarchy and Everyday Life, is actually the only one I've explored so far since I discovered this band while researching this video. Their original lead singer, Peter Hein, left the band not long after this first album was released, because their tour was changed from 3 weeks to 6 with very little notice. he returned to his job at Xerox, where it sounds like he worked until he rejoined the band in the early 90s. Unlike the other bands on this list so far, Fehlfarben has been active for a lot of the time since the 80s, having released albums steadily after the year 2000.
Berge explodieren, schuld ist der Präsident, das geht voran. Berge explodieren, schuld ist der Präsident, das geht voran.
They're now up to 12 studio albums and 3 live albums. In a story that should be getting familiar, their Monarchy in Everyday Life was a critical success that didn't translate to all that great of sales. It was recognized by critics as an important German rock record when it came out, and it still is recognized that way, but the album didn't even go gold in Germany until the year 2000. Musically, it reminds me a lot of Gang of Four, and at some points also of the Talking Heads. They include some horns here, more dance elements that were inspired by probably new wave as well. There's a great variety that's captured on this album, and this is a band that's fairly new to me. I discovered them while working on this video. I would say this album is the best new discovery for me while working on this. If you're a fan who knows this band better than I do, who can go beyond just that first album, tell us in the comments about what you think their best works are and what else we should check out. Number 5, at 72,000 listeners, Liquid Liquid. So this is a bit of a weird one, and I do expect some comments about this in the comments. So let me clarify a little bit. Liquid Liquid is a no-wave band, and I guess that means we should do a quick no-wave 101. No-wave was an avant-garde movement starting in the late 70s, which was a rejection of characteristics of the then popular new wave scene, hence no-wave. No-wave bands experimented with, essentially, all the traits that weren't being explored by either new wave or punk music. Dissonance, atonality, rejecting traditional song structures, and exploring influences generally ignored by new wave, like free jazz. Sonic Youth's early recordings were highly influenced by no wave, and through bands like Sonic Youth, no wave had an influence on the development of 80s alternative too, but that's a story for another time. Anyway, Liquid Liquid. They formed in 1980, and after a few arty and lo-fi experiments, started creating a unique, percussion-heavy new sound, with their music comprising of multiple percussionists, horns, vocals that served more as an instrument than as a method of conveying lyrics. They rejected traditional song structures, and were firmly DIY, which is why I feel they fit with these post-punk bands we're talking about. I can see them being inspired by bands like Talking Heads, but I also feel there's a connection to bands like Public Image Limited. Sadly, Liquid Liquid were only active for 3 years in their original run. A section of their song, Cavern, was copied by Grandmaster Melly Mel, and formed the basis of the hit song, White Lines, Don't Do It, without ever getting credited. The band's label, 99, went through multiple expensive legal battles to try and get the band the credit for this recording, and this cost the label a fortune. When they finally succeeded in court, Sugar Hill Records went bankrupt instead of paying out, and neither 99 or Liquid Liquid ever saw any money from this. The label went under, and Liquid Liquid disbanded. Despite their short run, Liquid Liquid had a big influence on early hip-hop, obviously, and they also had a big influence on the development of dance punk, which you can see in bands like Chick Chick Chick. So do yourself a favor and check out their small but really vital body of work. Number 6, Fad Gadget. Fad Gadget is a band that I was introduced to back when I was first getting into a lot of the 80s bands like Bauhaus, Cabaret Voltaire, Ministry. Then I discover a band that I thought of as really influential, only has 54,000 monthly listeners. This was a big surprise for me, so I really wanted to talk about them in this video. Fad Gadget was the stage name of Francis Tovey from London, England. He was drawn to music at a young age, but struggled to learn an instrument, so drifted to other artistic outlets, including mime. Then, when trying to create a soundtrack to go along with a mime performance, he started exploring experiments with tape machines, then gradually included some keyboards and other instruments in his musical explorations. Back to Nature was his first released song on Mute Records, and it found some immediate success. All of his studio albums were released in the first half of the 80s, and they merged synth-pop with a dark goth tone, and some elements that feel industrial as well. At his most poppy, he feels like a darker Depeche Mode or Soft Cell, but at the most experimental moments, it feels like one of the more out-there experiments of Bauhaus. For Fad Gadget, I recommend starting with Fireside Favorites, their first album from 1980. I'm basically just saying start at the beginning and keep working your way forward. For number 7, we're dropping down a lot lower in the listener count to 31,000. The Au Pairs were a post-punk band who formed in Birmingham in 1978. They lasted for 5 years, led by Leslie Woods, who delivers sharp social commentary. Like many of the bands we're covering, they didn't last that long, breaking up in 1983. From more recent interviews, it sounds like the band was pushing it too hard and too fast, and just burned out very fast. While there were other female-led post-punk bands, the Raincoats and the Slits, there weren't a lot of them, so I was really surprised to see one of the ones I consider quintessential with such a small listener count. Also, the Au Pairs feel very aligned in their music styles and their lyrics with the Riot Grrrl movement, which I would expect to keep their name a little bit more common in the conversation about post-punk. But for whatever reason, they're not getting as many listeners as they ought to be. Maybe the obscurity has to do with the fact that they have one really well-revered album. Most people kind of sleep on their second album, Sense and Sensibility, but most people sleep on their second album, Sense and Sensuality. I think both are worth listening to. Their first album, Playing with a Different Sex, is a post-punk classic, and their follow-up, Sense and Sensuality, doesn't get as much credit as it should. I would definitely say to start with the debut, which contains so many smart, politically scathing songs, ranging in topics from the unjust treatment of political prisoners, to domestic abuse, to the power negotiations involved in open relationships. Their song Ama focuses on treatment of political prisoners in Northern Ireland. When they were scheduled to perform on the BBC's Old Grey Whistle test, they were told they couldn't play this song because of its political content. However, the show is broadcast live, so they played it anyway, resulting in a ban from performing on the BBC. There's a long, great history of bands refusing to be censored on live television, and Au Pairs earned a place in that history. Number 8, Lowlife, at 21,000 listeners. Okay, I know this whole list is made up of bands I find underrated, but this band is very, very underrated. Lowlife formed under the name of Dead Neighbors in the early 1980s, and they released an album under this name in 1983. Their sound early on was a Cramps-inspired psychobilly, but their sound changed drastically after Will Heggie, previously a founding member of Cocteau Twins, joined in 1984. Their new sound was post-punk, it was a bit dream pop. It has a very goth rock feel to it as well, partially because of Craig Lawrence's vocals. His rich vocals add a lot to the atmosphere of the band, adding even more darkness to it than the music conveys. The band gets compared quite a bit to Cocteau Twins because of some similarities in their sound, but I think that the difference in the vocals gives them a bit darker of a feel than you usually have with the Cocteau Twins, with Elizabeth Fraser's vocals. You could start at the beginning of their career, or you could start with Diminuendo, which is my very favorite at this point. The music feels so rich, soft, and melancholic, creating a darker mood than you would expect from the cover. While Diminuendo is my favorite, their debut, Permanent Sleep, is almost as strong, and their third album, Godhead, is actually the one I've heard the most at this point. It feels a bit more post-punk and a bit less dream pop, although all of these albums have both elements. Godhead feels less musically gentle, but the songwriting is still beautiful. I rank all three of these albums very highly. And they didn't fall off after this either, releasing a total of 5 really solid, good albums. But be careful when streaming because there are multiple bands with the name Lowlife that get lumped together on streaming services, and I'm not vouching for the quality of all of them. Number 9, Ludus, at 2,600 monthly listeners. This is an odd one, and I'm guessing their artsiness is what has kept them fairly obscure. But I find their strange blend of free jazz and post-punk to be a unique take on what it means to be post-punk. They blended in genres that aren't generally thought of as punk-adjacent to make something that has a very DIY spirit and challenges our expectations about music. Ludus was the project of Linda Sterling. Sterling was already connected to the music scene through her visual art, having designed covers for magazines Real Life and for the Buzzcocks Orgasm Addict single. The band lasted from 1978 to 1984, recording 2 albums and a variety of singles and EPs in that time. On both albums, they range from fun and fairly accessible songs to musical experiments that are much more challenging. What I find really intriguing about this band is that they incorporate these things like jazz, almost no-wave elements. It feels like a band with no rules that's just doing literally anything they want. That's great to see, especially when you have a great vocalist and great musicians in the band. Some songs, like Breaking the Rules, feel like they could have been a hit at some point, and other songs are 10-minute pieces where they're flowing back and forth between free jazz and psychedelic moments that feel almost Grateful Dead, and doing all of this in one composition. It can go from very entertaining to very challenging very quickly on these albums, and maybe that's part of why they're not getting listened to as much as a lot of other post-punk bands at the time period. But isn't that breaking down of the rules and the boundaries what post-punk was really all about in the first place? I would consider Ludus to be the least accessible band on this list, but I think you should explore them and try them out to get a sense of what all was going on in post-punk. And for the final pick, number 10, The Astronauts, at 412 monthly listeners. So this band was so obscure, I had trouble finding really any verifiable information on them. So the history section is going to be a little bit brief here. They don't have a Wikipedia page. They are on streaming, but only a couple of albums, and both of those albums are listed under the wrong year. And to make it even more confusing, there are several bands with this name, so a lot of the times I thought I was reading about the right band, and I was reading about a surf band from the 60s. What I do know is the band formed in 1977, formed by Mark Wilkins, who for the sake of the band, went by Mark Astronaut. Similar to Mark E. Smith, whatever his current work was, it was an astronaut's project. If it was Mark Astronaut and Your Granny on the bongos, it was an astronaut's gig. The albums I've heard so far by this band are the first 2. Peter Pan hits the suburbs, and it's all done by Mirrors. The first of these goes back and forth between post-punk and a folkier style that reminds me of early Bowie. It feels on this album like Mark was listening to a wide range of music and not afraid to incorporate a lot of these inspirations into his work. Their second album, It's All Done by Mirrors, feels slightly more cohesive to me, although I recommend both. The second album moves further in a folk direction, and feels like it commits a bit more to making these musical styles work together and not just switching back and forth between them. I feel It's All Done by Mirrors pulls off this hybrid very well, and is a unique album that should be much better known than it is. So please, if this sounds intriguing, do yourself a favor and check out The Astronauts. So there you go, 10 bands from the early post-punk scene that are not getting the attention they deserve now. These range from bands that were exploring goth, to free jazz, to folk, to funk, and doing all of that while expanding upon the musical palette of punk. I came up with a much larger list, so if you want me to cover some more bands from this time period that would be worth your while to explore, let me know in the comments. Also let me know any bands that you think fall into this category of early post-punk bands that should be heard more. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and join me for some more musical adventures in the future. Next time I'll be covering the topic selected by the 1,000 subscriber contest winner, so come back for that. That'll be a lot of fun, and I'll see you in the next video. This has been Eclecticism. Thanks for watching.